Thank you very much. When discussing the salience of nuclear weapons after Ukraine, and I will emphasize in Europe after Ukraine, I'm afraid I'm not going to offer a very rosy picture. My starting point is to insist on the fact that some of the general assumptions of the post-Cold War era have been massively challenged by the most recent development of the last few years, especially in the context of the crisis over Ukraine and the growing tensions with the Russian Federation. Those assumptions were that there was an ever-reduced salience of nuclear weapons in the policies of the P5, that the nuclear dangers in the Euro-Atlantic area were vanishing. Many of us would have started a presentation about nuclear weapons in the 21st century by emphasizing that it was becoming an increasingly Asian issue. Thirdly, that there was a growing convergence in the nuclear postures of Western and Russian forces towards an increasingly existential nuclear posture. And fourthly, that there was a sort of ever-expanding role for arms control in this context. I think that those four trends combined made the risk of a nuclear crisis, let alone nuclear use, very unlikely. And I would argue that these premises are no longer true, at least for the time being, and that nuclear issues have made a dangerous comeback on the European security scene, primarily because of a Russian nuclear brinkmanship posture. So let me elaborate on a few points. First of all, this is not completely new. There is a Russian nuclear modernization process that is ambitious, sustained over time. Of course, it does echo Western nuclear modernization by the United States, France, and Britain. All four countries have taken decision in the last few years, and in a way, Russia is a bit catching up on that process after neglecting its nuclear forces in the immediate decade at the end of the Cold War. But in the Russian modernization process, there is a specific emphasis on more usable, short-range nuclear-capable system that is a matter of concern. Second point, I'm struck at the Russian nuclear doctrinal debate, which does emphasize the role of nuclear weapons in the overall military posture, which does envisage an early use in a crisis, and from my perspective signals an over-reliance on nuclear weapons as part of the overall strategic posture, including with strange notions such as the use of nuclear weapons to de-escalate a crisis, which are quite problematic. In this general context, there is a form of significant nuclear signaling, some would argue nuclear saber rattling on the part of Russian authorities, with multiple messages ranging from direct threats, the comments of the Russian ambassador in Copenhagen with regard to the deployment of missile defense capability by Denmark is one example. The on-the-ground multiple practical signaling in the forms of, for instance, overflight of nuclear bombers. If you talk to the French and the British Air Force, having to escort a Russian nuclear-capable bomber in the Channel that is in the middle of the most densely populated airliner region is a bit awkward. And that was a deliberate attempt. By the way, the Russian Air Force felt the need to put this on YouTube for you to share this moment of crisis. Thirdly, large-scale military exercise involving the use of nuclear weapons as part of the training. I think it's specifically about the Zapad exercise, amongst others. All of this creates serious risks of unintended crisis, because my assumption is not that we are on the verge of a nuclear confrontation, but that those signals and practice create de facto a significant risk of a crisis to emerge even unintendedly. Should, for instance, an accident occur with a civilian airliner and an airplane not using its transponder. That's a typical example. What would be the outcome of such a crisis? The fourth point I would like to emphasize is the new practice of a form of nuclear coercion. In a way, the Ukrainian crisis, and specifically the Crimean element of it, is a case for the development of a new form of what we called in the old days aggressive sanctuarization. But this time, this was not the policy of a proliferator that would pursue regional ambitions in the shadow of its emerging nuclear capability, typically the concern over what would have been the Iraq-Kuwait case with Iraq armed with nuclear weapons, but this is one of the P5 that is pursuing this policy. On top of this, we should add the fact that the overall architecture, the European security order, and the arms control regime is under stress. The Budapest Memorandum was just referred to. It was an important pillar of that order. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty is no longer in place to a large extent, and this is and we should remember that this conventional treaty followed the INF treaty. So there is a direct connection between our ability to sustain nuclear disarmament in the European context and the fact that there was a conventional forces balance system put in place. Thirdly, of course, there is a debate over INF compliance that is emerging and is quite distressing. These Russian developments have prompted a debate at NATO, which echoes to a degree this. We no longer have a debate about the potential withdrawal of non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe. The debate is currently more focused at NATO on the modernization process underway. The US government has taken decision to modernize the B-61 and to make the F-35 nuclear capable. Additional decisions are or will be taken by nuclear DCA allies in the alliance with the sort of debates that come with such decisions. There is also a renewed debate about the role of nuclear deterrence in the overall deterrence and defense posture of the alliance, which is likely to, I wouldn't say change the posture of the alliance. By the way, I don't think this is necessary, and I would argue with the fact that there is no need for the alliance to respond in a tit-for-tat or mirror policy to the development on the Russian side. But having said this, there is this ongoing debate which has also a bit of a Cold War flavor. If you add to this development in the missile defense scene, which are still and rightfully so connected to the missile developments in the Middle East, in Iran in particular, nevertheless you have elements that point at the fact that the 21st century could be, including in Europe, more nuclear than expected, not to say more nuclear than the 20th century. So in this rather bleak environment, the issue is, should we simply sit on our hands and wait for the next nuclear crisis to unfold and hope we manage to muddle through these crises as we've done in the past? I would argue that there is room to seriously think about these developments and address them. First of all, we do have a deterrent stability debate. There is a need to rebuild with Russia a common understanding about the role of nuclear deterrence, which is about preventing major wars, both nuclear and conventional, amongst major powers, and not about allowing coercion by nuclear weapon states. From that perspective, a common understanding on the fact that the way we foresee the potential use of nuclear weapons is extremely remote, as in the NATO languages, would be extraordinarily useful. Second point is, I think there is a need to engage in a serious thinking about nuclear CBMs and transparency measures. When it comes to exercising, I think it would be most unfortunate to find ourselves in a situation in which there would be a misunderstanding about nuclear-related exercises, about conventional exercise, so we need to be extraordinarily clear on both sides as we exercise more than we used to. There is a transparency dimension to all of this, and of course the potential deployment or rumors about deployment of nuclear-capable systems, both in Crimea and Kaliningrad on the one hand, and debates on whether the nuclear posture of the North Atlantic Alliance should be reviewed, are issues that need to be dealt in a fully transparent manner, and here again I tend to favor the status quo, but transparency is quintessential when it comes to those deployments. Thirdly, I do believe there is a room for a renewed arms control agenda. That might sound a bit rosy after my rather dark assessment, but I do believe that arms control, after all, is even more useful when parties are not in agreement over political issues, because then it serves a very central security purpose, and it's not done out of principle. From that perspective, there is one good news, which is the fact that New START is being implemented, and in spite of all the tensions, this is an ongoing process, and this is a process that is valuable and should be sort of firewalled from other developments, because it is an essential element to build a future with fewer nuclear weapons at the strategic level. On INF, there is obviously a need to reestablish trust over this. My assumption is that Russia is seeking to put INF aside, but there are genuine concerns associated with the testing of some Russian systems. Those should be addressed. And by the way, the mirror concern that Russia raised, which I don't think are quite as legitimate, ought to be addressed as well. This agenda should be probably broader. In a way, we've lost part of the arms control grammar in Europe, and the connection between the conventional side and the nuclear side need to be rethought. The central role of the Vienna document and the need to modernize it in order to establish more transparency and more CBMs should be seriously looked at. I very much look forward to the German efforts during the German OSCE chairmanship to go into this debate heads-on. I think it is a very wise approach. During the Cold War, we did recognize all these linkages. I think we should look through them again, and therefore arms control has a very important role. As a matter of conclusion, of course, the salience of nuclear weapons in the security policies of countries very much depends on the overall geopolitics. However, and even if I put aside politics for a moment, those nuclear risks should be addressed in order to mitigate the dangers of tensions in the Euro-Atlantic area to develop into a major crisis or an unintended significant crisis. Europe and the stakeholders in the Euro-Atlantic area, including the US and Russia, have argued for decades that we were a model for the rest of the world, with a unique web of CBMs, arms control, transparency, and stabilizing role for deterrence. I'm afraid we can no longer lecture Asians or Middle Eastern countries on the fact that they should take Europe for a model, but it's up to us to try to preserve what is still there and to rebuild something that would be meaningful, which again can be developed even in the absence of the sort of favorable political atmosphere that prevailed in the immediate post-Cold War era. In that context, I will wrap up with a bit of a question mark on the role for the EU in that context. My argument would be that a lot of these issues are tackled in other formats, in the NATO-Russia context, in Vienna, in the OSCE context, but that the EU, because it does stand for this rule-based order and also does stand for this approach to stability through a set of norms, and that many of the EU, all of the EU countries do abide these treaties, that we should definitely stand strongly in favor of such a stabilizing role for this web of norms that has played a very important role in preserving peace in the Euro-Atlantic area. Thank you very much.